Thank you. Bonjour, talofa, and welcome to each of you who are joining for this first roundtable session on the important topic of circular economy within the third Clean Pacific Roundtable, which it's my pleasure to be moderating. A very special welcome to our esteemed panelists who will be sharing their expertise and experience with us today. My name is Damien Jurko. I'm a director of the Product Stewardship Centre of Excellence and Deputy Director Research at the Institute for Sustainable Futures within the University of Technology, Sydney, where I'm Professor of Resource Futures. I'm also Deputy Program Lead for the theme of collaborating for a circular economy within the proposed Plastics Waste Cooperative Research Centre. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands the University of Technology, Sydney stands. And I pay respects to Aboriginal elders, past and present. And I further acknowledge and warmly welcome the rich breadth of knowledges and perspectives and stories that all peoples and cultures joining today bring to our discussion. And I am really looking forward to the insights and ideas we'll share and the collective action that it can inspire. We have three great Telenor panel discussions ahead. The first on what is circular economy and how does it apply to the plastic problem. Our second will be on what does circular economy look like in the Pacific. And finally, how to achieve circular economy in the Pacific. And let me say at the end of each panel discussion, we will have time for Telenor and Q&A, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Kate Noble, No Plastics in Nature Policy Manager at WWF Australia, who'll be moderating the Q&A. Thank you, Kate. And indeed, your input and contribution to Telenor and the discussion will be very much valued. So again, do please use the chat function for comments, any housekeeping, and particularly to type your questions for the speakers. All questions are welcome. There'll also be an opportunity to use the raise hand function in Zoom during Telenor and Q&A, and our technician will unmute you to allow you to ask your question. And as mentioned, you can also access captioned text from our speakers in English and French via Zoom. Before we hear from our panelists, please allow me a few minutes to set the scene with some personal reflections. I continue to be passionate about the circular economy and it's important to our future prosperity. And looking back on my own story, I recall fond memories of growing up in Geelong near Melbourne and of going with my grandfather to drop rubbish to the tip, the landfill. He was a carpenter, and while we were there, he'd spy products and materials that still had value, which could be brought home, fixed up, and further enjoyed, whether it's from bits of timber through to my favourite was a vintage Hoover Constellation, a spherical vacuum cleaner, which looked a little bit like a flying saucer that might house an alien, but leads to my take-home message number one, which is that materials have value. And even more so when we're creative with how we use and reuse them. Turning now to my dad's side of the family, who'd migrated to Australia from Trieste in Italy after the Second World War. My grandmother, when talking about anything from clothes to ice cream, would always be emphasizing it's the good quality as an attribute to be celebrated. And indeed, the good quality washing machine she bought for herself gave me another decade of service after she died, thanks to it being able to be repaired. And so my second take-home message is that good quality is worthwhile and can still be great value, even if it's more expensive to buy. My final reflection derives from being back with my mum's father, who in addition to enjoying taking me on trips to the landfill also liked fishing. I remember melting down old scraps of lead on a gas burner in his garage to pour into some molds to make sinkers to tie alongside the hooks when we were going fishing. Now, whilst at the time it conveyed a message about the potential for recycling metal, now, for me, it's also an important message that circular economy must be safe. We don't want toxic elements like lead or flame retardants in plastics unhelpfully going around the loop. Rather, we need a safe, circular economy in support of sustainable development goals. And these are messages I carried with me in my research work to today at UTS. The mission of the UTS Institute for Sustainable Futures is to create change towards sustainable futures in partnership with government, industry, and the community. And we have a fantastic team of over 100 research staff and PhD students working in areas ranging from water and climate change, including here in the Pacific, through to renewable energy and resource stewardship in the circular economy, whether for plastics, textiles, organics, batteries, and electronic waste. And in the face of complex sustainability challenges, the approach of partnering to create change is so important. Indeed, it's one we see adopted by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation as it really continues to amplify circular economy action around the globe. So I'm thrilled to announce that to kickstart our session, we'll now be hearing from Mr. Jocelyn Blériot, Executive Lead, International Institutions and Governments from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who's kindly recorded this message for us here in today's session.
Hello and welcome to the third Clean Pacific Roundtable. I'm Jos Blériot. I'm the Executive Lead for Institution, Governments and Cities program at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We're a UK-based think tank focusing on circular economy. And in this introductory session, I will be talking about the circular economy model and its relevance to a variety of topics, including plastics pollution, climate, biodiversity, and of course, economic opportunities. The objective of the session is to discuss what circular economy means from a global perspective and how it does apply to the plastic problem, which is now a major issue for the region of the Pacific, of course, and the world. And the roundtable will also discuss what circular economy looks like in the Pacific region. And we'll try to end up with a discussion on how the Pacific region can achieve the circular economy. But let us rewind a bit and potentially try to define what circular economy is. It rests on three principles, which are eliminating waste and pollution. It's about circulating materials and resources at their highest level of value, and it's about regenerating natural systems. So it really is much more than a standard waste management or resource management agenda. It talks about innovation, it talks about economic opportunities, and also the move towards a regenerative system that can prosper in the long term. In a sense, it's about feedstocks. It's about what we put on the market, the nature of that feedstock, and also the volumes. Do we actually put in what we need, or are we a bit more driven by sales and volumes for the sake of generating growth through that medium? It's about processes, and by processes, I mean the way things are designed, engineered, manufactured. Is there a way, for instance, to move simply beyond material efficiency and try to do a bit more volume with less materials? Or is it a question of looking at how a product can be, by design, fit for remanufacturing, for repurposing, for having various uses and life cycles? It's about durability. And that is not only in terms of actually what level of material, what nature of material, but also can the product evolve? Is it fit for multiple life cycles? And finally, of course, if it is going to have multiple life cycles, it's about business models. How we give access to those products without necessarily, in all cases, selling the product outright. Can companies, where applicable, remain the custodians of those materials? Do they have an incentive in that case to prevent premature obsolescence? Are they becoming the guardians of those resources and really the people who want to circulate them because they have an incentive to take them back, because the stock is not a hindrance, the stock is a wealth for a company. If your fleet of vehicles or washing machines remain your asset base, then you will look after them. And it's a question of really, are they then designed in order to be maintained and stay in the system for as long as possible? And that's the key question with circular economy. It is by design. It's about eliminating waste and pollution, circulating those resources, and regenerating natural systems. Now, we've seen the term pick up a lot recently, and it's gained an importance in the international debate. So it's important to try to look at where it's happening, where it comes from, and what the latest trends are. Of course, if we look at a global picture, in 2008, the Chinese government adopted its circular economy promotion law, which started life really as a 3R sort of concept, which was about reducing, reusing, and recycling, which is a very, very good place to start. But as we've seen the legislation evolve, it has moved upstream. It's more focused on eco-design, on innovation, because there's only so much you can do by acting downstream and trying to capture a bit more of the resources. Essentially, if you recycle a bit more, but you don't change the way things are produced, extracted, this amounts to digging the same hole, just a bit slower. And it's really encouraging to see that in China, as in the European Union, the move towards those upstream strategies is pretty clear. Now in Europe, the 2012 European Resource Efficiency Platform had a 2-year mandate and gave birth to the first Circular Economy Action Plan, published in 2014. The latest one has been adopted in March last year. And the interesting thing is that it is a key pillar of the European Green Deal. So circular economy is not a standalone strategy. It does help the European Union achieve its climate and biodiversity goals as well. It's about a positive model. And interestingly, for this discussion, the subtitle of the current action plan is For a Clean and Competitive Europe. Because again, I'm going back to my point about feedstock. What you put on the market really does determine what you can do with those resources. Are they single use? Are they fossil fuel based? Can they safely go back to the biosphere? Are they pollution in waiting? All these things happen at the source, and this is why it's so crucial to see the move of circular economies towards upstream and prescription of what we put on the market rather than simple waste management strategies, which do, by the way, remain extremely important. What we've seen as well over the past 2 years is the multiplication of the regional alliances. We've seen the Latin American and Caribbean Circular Economy Alliance, which is backed and organized by UNEP, UNIDO, with also influence from the World Economic Forum, and on which actually the foundation, my organization, sits as a strategic partner. We have seen more recently the African Circular Economy Alliance gain prominence as well. And I think, but don't quote me on this, that they currently have 10 governments involved. We are also there taking a strategic advisor role in the alliance, helping create the right common language and pinpoint the economic opportunities. The concept was also pushed by the European Union outside of its border through a mechanism called GACERE, which is the Global Alliance for Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency, which to this day, I think, and don't quote me again, gathers 15 international governments. And the idea here is to say what we're trying to do within the Union, within the 27 member states, would be beneficial to export as a strategy for positive development around the world. And of course, that has trade implications. The European Union has joined forces with UNEP and UNIDO in that instance as well. So it really is interesting. And our friends from CITRA, the Finnish Development Fund, are also part of this initiative. So it really is interesting to see that from pockets of circular economy, we're now moving to a more globalized discussion. And of course, at United Nations level, this was sanctioned by the fact that at UNEA 4 in Nairobi in March 2019, a resolution was adopted on innovative pathways for sustainable consumption and production, which essentially deals with SDG number 12, which the resolution recognizes the utmost importance of circular economy when it comes to achieving SDG 12. And of course, we also need to look at the circular economy as a global framework in order to provide solutions to the biggest challenges we face. Climate change, of course, biodiversity loss. Because if we look at the global GHG emissions, we see that 45% of these come from the products and the food that we have in the system. So we've been focusing, for the right reasons, on energy systems a lot, moving to renewables and fostering more energy efficiency, but that is 55% of the equation. If we do not tackle the models of production and consumption, like the food system, or plastics, or the built environment, or mobility, all of these things are absolutely critical to get us to the 1.5 degree pathway, which is a question of vital importance, literally. And so looking at the circular economy strategies is extremely critical. And of course, you'll understand that the second principle is about keeping materials in circulation. Well, that means essentially that what you don't waste, you don't need to replace. So you negate all the impacts of extraction and pollution that goes into creation of raw materials. The International Resource Panel reminds us that 23% of global GHG emissions are due to the production of raw materials. Raw materials, we're not even talking about finished products. So it's absolutely imperative to reduce the pressure on these resources and the extraction activities. At the end of the day, it is about switching from a model that depletes resources towards one that builds economic, social, and natural capital. And I'm sure today's discussions will greatly help moving to that perspective. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And following Joss's great opening video message, highlighting both the potential and progress with advancing the circular economy, we now have a very exciting lineup of speakers for you who will each be giving 5 to 6 minute overviews to kickstart the discussion. In our first panel, we'll be hearing from Ms. Astrid Schumacher from the European Commission's Directorate General for Environment, Meredith Epp from the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, and Dr. Karen Robenhammer from the University of Wollongong in Australia. Our second panel will feature Australian waste expert Mike Richie, plus Shalin Singh from Lautoka City Council in Fiji, and Jack Smith, a sports events manager with several high-profile Pacific events under his belt. And finally, our third panel will comprise Mr. Kosi Latu, the current Director General of SPREP, Taufia Patola, representing Tuvalu's Ministry of Local Government and Agriculture, and Mr. Stefan Awadra, Head of UNEP's Pacific Office in Samoa. So let's make a start. Our first session really aims to set the scene here, looking at some of the key circular economy efforts and outcomes internationally. So we'll hear about and have a chance to discuss circular economy work across Europe, emerging circular economy efforts in the Pacific, and the involving international discussion on a proposed global agreement to address plastic pollution. Further reminder to use the chat function as the speakers are talking, to write your comments and questions that we can then come to in the Q&A. So our first speaker is Ms. Astrid Schumacher, a lawyer by training and the Director for Global Sustainable Development in the European Commission's Directorate General for Environment. Since joining the Commission in 1992, she has held a variety of posts in the areas of international relations and environment policy, amongst them leading the work on chemical policy, marine issues, and the EU's environment policy strategy to 2030. Astrid, welcome.
Thank you very much, Damien. Thanks for the nice introduction. And also thank you for the great scene setting with a couple of stories to which I can directly relate with my sort of European perspective on the circular economy, which of course Jocelyn has also in his opening video already described. So what I wanted to do is share a bit with you, how do we see the circular economy in Europe? Why is it important for us? Why do we see it as a global model? And how does it then also relate to the plastic challenge we all face, and of course specific countries in particular? Now, when we speak about the circular economy in Europe, we often like to say it's a paradigm shift. But as you, Damien, have explained very clearly in the beginning, it's actually not a paradigm shift. It's in a way also going back to valuing things that we used to value, but in a way have forgotten. So we have come to see these fast-moving economies where we extract something, produce something, consume it, and then throw it away. And this is not something we believe is sustainable and not something we can have as an economic model in the long term. So rather, we would like to see the economy to be circular, meaning that we maximize the use of resources throughout the life cycle of products, and thereby minimizing waste. And as Justin was explaining, of course, in the first place, extracting less. And this is also about changing the economic model and coming to a different way of using our products, sharing, leasing, reusing, or repairing, refurbishing, recycling existing materials. All of that are new words that we use a lot more that our parents used to say, and we perhaps have become a bit unfamiliar with. Now, why are we doing all this? In the words of UN Secretary General Guterres, the world is facing a triple crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And not only do these three phenomena exacerbate each other, we also see that they have one thing in common, and that's global unsustainable resource use. And then, of course, they're compounded by continued population growth and rapid urbanization. So all of this is something that we need to address. And what we see as necessary is moving to a regenerative economy that doesn't do harm, but even tries to reverse climate change and environmental degradation in the long term. Now, for us, at the core of this is indeed the circular economy. Justin has explained it to perfection, so I won't go into that in more detail, but just to say, in the EU, we now have our second circular economy action plan. Its objective is to make sustainable products the norm on our market. What does that mean? It means that we will come out with a sustainable product policy initiative later this year, actually, which will address all products produced or sold in the European Union with a view to extending their lifetime and reducing the environmental impacts of their production. Now, when we talk about that, it's important to recognize that 80% of environmental impacts, more or less, are determined by product design. So it is really in the design phase that we have to focus. And so what we will do is we will use our Eco Design Directive to make sustainability principles applicable to all products put on the European market. But when we talk about the circular economy, it's really important to bring in all actors. So we're also looking at strongly involving and empowering consumers so that they can start not only benefiting from a right to repair, but also driving the transition to a circular economy. So that involves, for example, better product information, fighting false green claims, etc. And we want to work very closely, of course, with the business sector. So we have set up a circular economy platform, bringing in all stakeholders to discuss the transition, and also specifically on plastics. We have founded the Circular Plastic Alliance to promote voluntary action for more recycled plastics. But to come back to our Circular Economy Action Plan, we've also found it important beyond the broad horizontal actions and involving all actors to focus on a series of value chains where the potential for circularity is greatest. And there we have identified textiles, batteries, electronics, plastics, packaging, food and water, and of course, plastics. And I want to come back to plastics in a moment. when we talk about the Global Plastics Agreement. Just to say here, Damien, as you were saying, for us, very important that this is a clean circular economy, so that we also simultaneously work on the toxic content of products, so that circularity does not mean that we perpetuate toxics in the environment. Now, all of this should not just happen in the European Union. We don't want to have a closed circle, but we're looking at a global circular economy. We think the challenges we are facing are global, and therefore the solutions as well. That means, as European Union, we want to reach out to partner countries around the world, both regionally and globally. Globally, Jocelyn has already mentioned the Global Alliance on Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency, which is about supporting a global transition to a circular economy. So governments coming together, exchanging experience, looking at governance, at gaps of governance and how they can be filled. But also regionally and specifically looking at the Pacific, of course, we are already working with the Pacific region in the Pacific EU Waste Management Program, which I think some of you may know, the PAC Waste Plus, which is implemented in 15 different Pacific countries and targets the sustainable management of waste and pollution, but then also the broader impacts, for example, on human health, on well-being, and also on disaster management and resource recovery. So this is then about working together to address solid waste management, so the implementation of prevention and reduction programs that promote schemes to minimize the waste generated from imported products and prevent the import of some single-use products. Now that's a concrete example how we can work together. If I speak of single-use products, and I want to close with that, plastics of course come to mind. So as part of the European EU plastic strategy, we have been legislating against the use of certain single-use plastics. Some of them will be banned, for others we will have design requirements. This is a very sort of staggered approach, depending on the use and depending on the availability of replacements. But one issue that we're all concerned about, I think Pacific Island states specifically, but we in the European Union just as well, is the global plastics crisis, as it becomes obvious when we look at our oceans. And there, of course, and that's not really my last few words on that, of course, we have seen a lot of progress made in the past years, action also taken by Pacific countries, supported by the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, action taken around the world by regional seas conventions. All of that is important because, of course, the plastic value chain by its nature is transboundary. The problem itself, therefore, of global scale. Plastics produced in the EU might as well end up on the shores of the United States. American plastics end up on the coast of Samoa, etc., etc. So here we saw the Basel Convention take decisive action in 2019. It's an important breakthrough. And for the first time, the international community agreed on binding rules to address one of the main problems related to plastic pollution, which is the unsustainable trade in plastic waste. But that, we think, is not enough. And that is why we are, together with many other countries, are now focusing on UNEA, the United Nations Environment Assembly, next year, and why we want to work with others to see how we can bring all this dispersed national and isolated action together in a global plastics agreement that would actually, and that's the circular economy idea there, that would actually look at the upstream part of the plastics life cycle. So in other words, preventing that plastics end up as waste in the first place. So we have already seen many countries support this approach, certainly the EU and its member states, but also countries in Africa, in Asia and Latin America. And of course, we would encourage all Pacific countries to join this endeavor. And I think we have a great presentation on that subject later on. So in conclusion, we'd love to work more with the Pacific countries on all issues related to circularity and on plastics in particular. We are in the process of also looking at our new multi-annual financial program for the Pacific, and we think there will be many opportunities to step up our cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Astrid, for both comprehensive and constructive remarks, which really set us up well for this discussion. And what strikes me is that maturity of experience we can now draw on as we seek to broaden the adoption of circular economy, which is a great wealth of knowledge to tap into. Let's go now to our second speaker for this panel. Meredith Epp is the Sustainable Programs Officer at the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, or APCO. And Meredith is a sustainability and communications professional with a specialty in marine plastics and the circular economy. At APCO, Meredith drives collaboration between industry, governments, and community groups to reduce the environmental impact of packaging. She's the executive lead for the ANZPAC Plastics Pact, a regional solution working to create a circular economy for plastics in the Pacific region. ANZPAC is the second regional pact in the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Plastics Pact network. Meredith, over to you.
Thanks, Damien, and thank you to SPREP and to the hosts of the roundtable here today for having me. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which we all gather, wherever you may be. Where I am here in Sydney, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the traditional owners past, present, and emerging. So Damien, Astrid, thank you for the great frame up and starting the conversation off. Like we mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about the ANZPAC Plastics Pact here today. And really my key kind of message for you is why we need collaboration in order to create a circular economy. So ANZPAC, or the Australian, New Zealand, Pacific Islands Plastics Pact, is really here to focus on creating a circular economy for plastics. So what is ANZPAC? ANZPAC is a collaborative solution that brings together key players behind a shared vision of circular economy for plastic, where plastic never becomes waste or pollution. So ANZPAC is a leading organization that is ready to take action on plastics and to collaborate collectively to implement solutions across Australia, New Zealand, and island regions. So ANZPAC is part of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Global Plastics Pact Network, which we've heard a little bit from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation before, talking about why it's really important that we don't just take a national or even a regional approach. We need to do that, and we need to look down at the community base. But circular economy is very much a global conversation. So as Damien mentioned, we are the 11th Plastic Pact, the second regional pact, so working between Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. And it's really important that we take this global approach. And what sort of sets the Plastics Pact network apart from other plastics initiatives working in this space is that idea of shared global communications, shared ideas, but also the reporting that all of the members do. So there's over 1,000 organizations that are committed behind the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's global vision of where plastic never becomes waste or pollution. And through the pact, our members coming this January will be looking to start reporting on their actions against the pact and the targets that are within them. So that's a little bit of our vision. If you want to pop on to the next slide, I'll just speak to the ANZPAC vision as well. So ANZPAC Plastics Pact envisions a connected and resilient region that delivers a circular plastics economy through robust collaboration with benefits for communities, economies, and natural ecosystems. And it's really important that we take this regional approach and that we're conscious of the fact that we don't necessarily want to be retrofitting something that's happened in Europe, something that's happened in the States or in Australia, that there are a lot of really important solutions that we can learn from our own communities. So it's really important that we have this two-way dialogue and two-way communication. And what works for a small regional remote community in far north Queensland or in remote New Zealand, and what are those kind of similarities that we have throughout the Pacific Islands. It's also important that by working towards this common vision together and through that reporting that the members do, it helps us to inform some of those critical design decisions and is able for us to help shift the Titanic faster than we normally would if we were to do this on our own. All right. If we want, just getting a little bit of background noise. So I'll talk a little bit now about the 4 targets. So ANZPAC and our 100 member organizations that have come to be part of this cross-collaborative regional solution have committed to taking action towards these 4 targets. So the first is to eliminate unnecessary and problematic plastic packaging through redesign, innovation, and alternative delivery reuse methods. That second target is the 100% of plastic packaging to be reusable, recyclable, or compostable. Astrid and Jacques both spoke a little bit around that importance of design and upstream innovation. And that's really where this design element and designing out any kind of eliminating unnecessary problematic plastics come into this part of the conversation in those first two targets. The third target is increasing the current plastic packaging collected and effectively recycled by at least 25% for each geography within the ANZPAC region. Again, this is really important and where it's important to have a diverse group of stakeholders working towards this body of work and communicating and educating to help consumers, citizens, and businesses make sure that the plastic packaging is ending up in the right bin or the right area for that to be effectively collected and recycled. And that last really important target is the average of 25% recycled content in all plastic packaging across the region. Now, this target will be a bit of a challenge for us, making sure that we can meet that 25% target, but it helps to create that demand mechanism that's so critically important to close the loop on the circular economy for plastic packaging. Over the past few months, so ANZPAC launched in May of 2018 with 60 members. We're now happily at over 100 members from across industries, large and small, the waste and recycling industry, packaging manufacturers, as well as governments and industry groups. And through that time since May, we've been focusing on a few key activities over the next financial year. So one of that is to commence a regional recyclability assessment. That's really to help us understand baseline where are we at around these targets and for our members to start to report against that. Over the next few months, we'll also be working on a cross-regional roadmap. So what are those major systematic shifts that we need to achieve to create this transformational change? We're doing that and having those conversations through the ACAG, which you see there, which is the ANZPAC Collective Action Group, and also strategic working streams. And those are made up of all of the different ANZPAC members, representatives across these different organizations to have robust conversations about how do we shift the dial. That last little bit there too is around pilot programs. So these will be commencing shortly, some small pilots to help us inform and take some key learnings across the organizations so that we can help to continue to accelerate action on plastic packaging. So just here on my last slide, if you can take one thing out of my presentation today, it's please know that collaboration is absolutely critical and key, whether you're a business, large, small, industry group, large, small, within the Pacific Islands, New Zealand, Australia, or globally working somewhere else. Everyone absolutely has a role to play to work towards achieving the circular economy and driving those visions that have been set out globally through different policies and through different initiatives like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's New Plastics Economy. So if you have any further questions around ANZPAC, the team are on the line here today. We'd be happy to share information and have a further conversation with you. Thanks so much, Damien.
Thank you very much, Meredith, for your presentation and indeed for all the collaborative work which APCO is championing. And I will now hand over to Kate Noble to introduce a short video.
Thanks very much, Damien. We thought just to act as a bit of a scene setter for the next presentation from Dr. Robenhammer, we'd show you a short video which was co-produced by SPREP and WWF Pacific and WWF Australia as part of the formal proceedings at the Global Ministerial Meeting on Marine Litter and Plastic Pollution just a few months ago, which happened in Geneva in September. Obviously, COVID travel restrictions meant that many people who would have liked to have attended from our region weren't able to, so we're attending online very, very late at night. And our intention was really to ensure that a really strong Pacific perspective on that issue was represented at that meeting. So that was the thinking behind the video. It just provides a nice little intro to Dr. Robenhammer's presentation on the moves towards and discussion around a global agreement to tackle plastic pollution. So let's take a look at the video.
Pacific Island countries make a tiny contribution to global plastic pollution, but our region is grossly and disproportionately affected by it. The highest recorded density of floating plastics is in the South Pacific subtropical gyre. As Pacific people, the ocean is the foundation of our cultures, our livelihoods and identities. Our health and prosperity relies on the health of our ocean, and support for a global treaty in our region is strong and growing. The vast majority of members of the Pacific Regional Environment Program support a global instrument to tackle plastic pollution. As stewards of vast marine territories, we are at the front line of this problem, and we see its effects every day. We understand that we have obligations towards our ocean, which supports and sustains us, and these responsibilities do not stop at national borders. The work of Pacific Island countries and our region as a whole is guided by the Cleaner Pacific 2025 strategy, and from this year, our 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. Importantly, this 2050 strategy will prioritize ocean and climate change considerations in all regional and national policies and plans. Already, 3/4 of our member states have introduced or committed to legislation to ban single-use plastic bags and other plastic products. Early this year, the Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Plastics Pact was launched, which will see governments, businesses and civil society working together to drive down plastic use and increase recycling. Our work is making a difference, but to be truly effective, it needs to sit within a global framework. Strong commitment to tackling plastic pollution in our region is a start, but it will not address this global problem quickly or effectively enough. For that, we need a legally binding global agreement. UNEA 5.2 represents a critical and historical point to make change. We urge all countries to work together at UNEA 5.2 to establish an intergovernmental negotiating committee to start work on a treaty as soon as possible.
Thank you, Kate. What a compelling video. It underscores, for me, the importance of not only getting our strategies and policies right, but just how important that effective communication is in mobilizing change. Let's go now to our third speaker for this panel. Karen Robenhammer is a lecturer at the University of Wollongong, Australia, and holds a PhD in international policy to prevent marine plastic pollution. She was lead author of the 2017 UNEP report, assessing the effectiveness of relevant international and regional governance strategies presented at UNEA 3. Karen co-developed for the Regional Seas Strategic Directions 2022 to 2025 and authored the UNEP guidelines for marine litter action plans. She's currently working with UNEP in developing global plastics indicators. Karen is lead author of the 2020 report commissioned by the Nordic Council of Ministers, outlining the elements of a new global plastics agreement. Karen, you have the screen.
Thank you, and I hope you can see my screen correctly. So thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with you guys today to talk about the design of a global treaty to address plastic pollution and how the discussions are going at the international level. Firstly, we know there are gaps that need to be addressed by a global agreement, and we know that only around 9% of plastic is actually recycled. We've seen big global gaps in the governance of marine litter at the international level, particularly around management, where there's a lack of globally binding standards, including product design standards. Around coordination, we see a lack of an institution with a mandate to coordinate the efforts across the multiple agreements. And then for assessment, we see the a lack of global standards for monitoring and reporting, and in many areas also a lack of data, which is all compounding the issue. As I mentioned before, we're only recycling about 9% of the plastics that we produce. The rest is mostly discarded or incinerated. So it's not returned to the economy, which is a problem. And that's one of the areas that we need to try and tackle through a global agreement. Research has also identified the circularity gap, with many countries focusing on the need for a circular economy for plastics. There are big gaps between the amount of recycled material that is required and the amount that is available on the market. And this circularity gap is probably one of the primary barriers to attaining a circular economy. And this is one of the areas we need to also focus on at the international level. The primary challenges have been identified as one of economics, where virgin resins are cheaper than recycled resins. We also see an imbalance in infrastructure, where our global supply chains are designed to produce products and move them around the world, but not necessarily to take them back. But we do have some things in our favor as well, and this is an increased consumer desire for recycled content and to see a reduction in plastic waste. We also have a number of commitments from brands and industry for recycling and recycled plastics, and many of these are short-term targets. And this is particularly where the issue of the circularity gap is going to cause a problem for us to meet those targets. So many of these look like they're national issues, and they are to be designed in at the national level. But how do we include these at the global level and design a global agreement to help attain these achievements at the national level, but also break down the barriers? So when we're looking at the elements of a new global agreement, there's a few fundamental questions we should be asking ourselves. What do we want to govern at the global level? And this can be very different to what we want to govern at the national level. What information do we need to track progress? And this is important because it's quite expensive and difficult to track all the indicators we'd like to know. And what role should industry play? Because we know we're not going to achieve this without industry playing a very big part. So in looking at the objective of a global agreement, I think we've got three options available to us. The first is a reduction of marine litter. This would build on the regional seas conventions and action plans, but we may have limited options for addressing the design of plastic products and tracking progress at the global level across multiple instruments. We could move one level upstream and target sustainable waste management. And this could work towards reducing waste generation, particularly through promoting the 3R waste hierarchy. But this approach would also facilitate a reduction in marine litter. But once again, it may be difficult to address the inputs of natural resources through this approach. So what we need to aim for is sustainable consumption and production, as we've been discussing here today. This would help us achieve the first two options of sustainable waste management and reduction of marine litter. It would also help reduce residual waste across the value chain and reduce natural inputs, and can include elements of design, resource efficiency, and climate change. So it's a much more holistic approach, which we should be aiming for. The scope of the agreement must also take into account the full life cycle, the global value chain, with all sectors and stakeholders that make up that value chain, as well as the cross-cutting issues of chemicals and microplastics. We've seen some designs put forward. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation, together with WWF and the Boston Consulting Group, calls for elimination of plastic leakage into the ocean through harmonized definitions and standards, a common approach to national targets and action plans, reporting standards, and an international capacity building mechanism. We also see the Environmental Investigation Agency, which suggests targeting the elimination of plastic pollution in the environment more broadly, not just the marine environment, and aims to create a safe circular economy for plastics. And this also includes a reduction in the production of virgin plastics. Another design put forward is based on three goals of minimizing virgin plastic production and consumption, facilitating safe circularity of plastics, and eliminating plastic pollution in the environment. And this recognizes that the second goal of safe circularity will also help deliver on goals 1 and 2 in the long term. And lastly, a design that has been formally submitted to the AHEG process as a global response option is based on international sustainability criteria. These criteria would outline how products should perform while in use, but also at the end of life. So these sustainability criteria would form the basis of national sustainability criteria that can be incorporated into national regulatory and market-based instruments. So if a product doesn't meet the sustainability criteria, it may, for example, be eligible for a ban, a higher tax, or the producer must develop a take-back scheme. A focus here on the design of products is a key mechanism to closing that circularity gap we've been talking about, and to improve the supply of recycled material to meet the demand for including recycled content in products, while also targeting the elimination of problematic and avoidable plastic products and chemical hazard reduction, because as we know, we want safe circularity here. By stimulating better design, we can create value in waste and stimulate greater collection, which is the first step to circularity. For the Pacific, this means greater economy of scale because more products are recyclable in the local context. And it also means easier export of recyclable plastic waste under the Basel Convention amendments. If we don't stimulate better design, we'll always be catching up with waste management. So just to end off, as we know, there is strong support for the establishment of an international or an intergovernmental negotiating committee next year. We've heard of work being done that could support the negotiating committees such as the WTO and Interpol, but UNEP is also working on recommendation of a framework of indicators for marine litter and plastic pollution. And this will assist in understanding what we can measure and how, and also what aspects of the life cycle we want to target. The development of national source inventories to support national action plans is also underway, and the GPML digital platform is seeking to improve the science policy and interface and harmonize national actions amongst other areas of focus. So with that, I thank you for your time and I look forward to discussions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen, for your presentation and opening remarks. And it's now with great pleasure that I'll hand over to Kate Noble to moderate the Telenor Q&A session.
Great, thank you. If we have any questions, please feel free to raise hands and we'll unmute you to ask those. While people are sort of coming up with and mulling over those questions, I might ask a question that any of the panelists might like to respond to kick off. And it's quite a broad one. It's really around who the actors are who are accelerating this process of transitioning to a circular economy and looking at this from a regional perspective, and who's potentially holding us back and what can we do to move ahead and really start to tackle those barriers. If anyone wants to just jump in.
I guess I can speak a little bit to some who are, and Karen, I really liked how you used the headwinds and the tailwinds analogy in that slide just before. I think that's a nice way to think about it. Speak to a little bit of who is leading in this space. And I do have to say, I think we've seen a lot of industry leadership doing some great work in this, especially kind of in the retail, the FMCG space, particularly here in Australia, which is quite inspiring and seen a real commitment from those organizations. But there's no doubt that there's certainly more to be done. And I think it's the idea that we need to collaborate that much more. So speaking for us specifically in the plastics packaging space, there's a lot of work that needs to happen around soft plastics, especially around the collection of soft plastics. For our region in particular, soft plastics really and flexibles, they have a lot of benefits because of the reduced carbon footprint, often the shelf life that they provide to different food materials that might be traveling long distances to regional areas. So there's a lot of work that needs to be happening there, but we have seen industry come together and collaborate. We've seen a few different product stewardship initiatives coming out here in Australia that are really working together throughout industry. For example, the first Kit Kat bar that was used through advanced recycling for that soft plastics wrapper. So there is some work happening here, and I think the pressure's on and industry stepping up and taking that challenge, but it's not without the support. And I do think that governments and across the board, we all need to be doing a bit more.
I do have a follow-up question for that actually, and it's for you, Karen. So your circularity gap chart was a really interesting one, and there's a clear role for a global agreement to play in reducing that circularity gap. But given that this process is going to take some time, if indeed it gets started. What do you think are the kind of the big impact key areas for national and regional action to start closing that circularity gap? You're still on mute, sorry, Karen.
Still muted. Well, there we go. I think it all boils down to design, as we've been saying. It is a slightly longer term kind of approach, but while we're trying to reverse engineer waste and recycle it, we're going to be spending a lot of time and effort and money trying to do that. So where we can work at the national and regional level is these type of sustainability criteria, which is not to dictate and prescribe how a product must be, what material and processes it should use, but more how it must behave and how it must perform. So it's more of the environmental criteria around that. And it's really looking at those criteria and saying, well, this product doesn't meet it. And we want to act as a region or as a country, but also globally. And I think we need to start really looking at what those criteria can be. The EU's got some good examples that can be followed. I think they're leading in this. And there's a very strong basis there that we can build on at the international level and that regions can learn from and sort of tailor towards themselves. But I think we just have to focus on design, and the sooner we get onto that, the better, because it's going to take some time.
It leads me beautifully into a question that I have for Astrid, actually. Astrid, you talked a bit about some of the right to repair initiatives and eco-design initiatives in the EU. Can you tell us a bit about some of the kind of the carrots and sticks that you're aware of that have been really effective or seem to be really promising in driving circular economy and right to repair and reuse?
I think I'll give the same reply as Meredith. I think a couple of drivers in the European Union. Firstly, certainly consumers. So what consumers want on our markets, I think, has been a strong driving factor. And we're trying to sort of stimulate it further by saying we want to enable consumers to know more about the products they're buying, which is why we do a lot about labeling, about product passports, about information on product content, etc. So that's a strong driver. A second strong driver, just because Meredith hasn't mentioned it, but I'm sure it's the same in Australia, is for us actually Corona and the COVID crisis, because I think in many ways we have seen that our supply chains are by no means as stable as we thought they would be, and our economic model is not as resilient as we thought it would be. And at the same time, we also see that we can do things differently in ways we never imagined before. And all of that is a massive new driver for us to rethink our economy and also to look at circularity from the perspective of either shorter supply chains or more stable supply chains of domestically sourcing, rather than sort of extracting things from far away and bringing them in, doing urban mining, using the gold you have in your telephone or the plastic that's already in your market and recycling that and reusing it. So that has been a second very strong driver. But overall, I think it's also businesses coming on board, looking at it as profitability, from the profitability perspective, and then governments pushing it very much because we see such a massive job creation potential, especially in the plastics economy as well. And if I can say one more thing, just commenting on Karen, I think we in the European Union would probably go further than you say, because when we speak about product design, we see the need to actually come forward with some mandatory rules. For example, on avoiding toxins in plastics, or also looking at the composition of plastics, which very often makes it incredibly difficult to recycle so I'll leave it at that. But we think government has to play probably a stronger role than it so far has.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Astrid. And I guess bringing it back to the region, Meredith, you talked a bit about industry initiatives and how they were kind of driving collaboration on this issue across the Pacific. But what are the kind of regulatory areas and where can legislation be sort of supporting and driving that work? You know, what do we need to be seeing at national level and right across the region that really helps to move this forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, Kate, and I think we would have seen Australian government a couple of weeks back now putting a formal video out and supporting the UNEA 5.2, so that Australian government is working towards that. And I've also come on board to formally support the ANZPAC Plastics Pact. I think more collaboration, and we saw, I believe it was earlier this year too, that the Prime Minister between Australia and New Zealand have come together and committed to working closely on circular economy and collaborating together. So I think those are the kind of things where there's further collaboration between us and between the region. Last week in APCO, which is the lead organization for ANZPAC, we hosted what was called the Collective Impact Summit and released a large report kind of tracking the 2025 national packaging targets for Australia. And there were a lot of conversations there. And Astrid, you may have seen this happening in the EU and in the UK around recycled content, and conversations around the need to potentially mandate recycled content, or what are some of those other economic incentives that governments might be able to play a role where there's either a disincentive to using virgin materials or further support for recycled content materials or reuse or new business models. But I think what's really powerful about this, and I know Mike Richie will talk about this more in his presentation later, is so much of this is about getting the economics right so that we can have those positive environmental outcomes at the end of the day. But to really create these transformational changes is that we need to kind of have these open conversations around what's the business case, how's this going to work, and getting the right players on board and genuinely committing to making some serious changes.
Thanks, Meredith. Joshua's popped a really great question in the chat, which is around the kind of lack of really widespread awareness of what a circular economy is. And he's talking specifically at kind of within Pacific governments, but I think this is an issue right across the board, perhaps less so in Europe, but there's certainly, not a great understanding of what a circular economy looks like in relation to plastics, and some misunderstandings, I think, as well. So Josh's question is really around, a lot of governments are familiar with the concept of sustainability and related concepts, but circularity is not currently really widely understood. And how do we start helping them to understand that, have that conversation and really focus in on what circularity is really accurately, rather than just kind of picking pieces out of it and driving forward with that. Astrid, that might be a good one for you in terms of, Europe's been through this process, and I'm sure that, this probably resonates with you. I think it's really an issue across the board. Have you got any reflections on that one?
Yeah, well, the way we started in Europe was on the concept of resource efficiency. And I think it all started basically from the idea of there being planetary boundaries, and from everybody looking at the trends in resource extraction and seeing those trends just go up basically through the roof, and then looking at population growth and the growing middle class and what that would mean for resource consumption. And it just being clear that for a number of resources, they would at some point become scarce, prices would be volatile. So there was an interest then also from the business sector to come in and say, well, we want to change a little bit the way we use resources. But for us, it was, I think, really looking at where we are. In Europe is a country without many resources of our own. So we import many of the raw materials from far away. And that is not necessarily a sustainable model in a volatile world, let's put it that way. So there was also the security and stability interest in saying, let's be able to resource things and use what we already have in our markets. So very much an economic consideration, which took a while, because when we started off in 2014, the business sector was really sort of, go away. What is this latest green idea? And a couple of years later, it's now actually in Europe, it's the business that is leading the transition. So it's that story of using what you have in your market and making it cheaper and building around it a story of job creation and economic growth.
Karen, Meredith, did you have any reflections on that, or should we move on?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I might add. I've seen the circular economy or heard it being used in so many ways, and sometimes even if it's just using a byproduct in a linear fashion, they're touted as the circular economy. But I think just to sort of broaden out on what's been said is that the circular economy is wonderful, but it won't necessarily, if we don't do it right, it's not going to achieve all the environmental outcomes that we want. So, I always say we have to slow it down through reuse mechanisms, we have to shrink it through reduction mechanisms, and then we have to clean it up. And that's the chemical component that Astrid was talking about. We can't put things back in the system if they're not suitable for this, and they're going to reintroduce any toxins and that. So it's about cleaning it up, shrinking it, and slowing it down as well, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, these conversations about systems level change can be really difficult to kind of gain traction in from a policymaker's perspective sometimes, and also from a public perspective. And sometimes I find it's really useful to kind of shrink it down to a specific product or a specific practice or an industry. And, you know, something like coffee cups, which are really visible, tangible, you know, we can see how they're being used, we can see how wasteful that product is, and we can see kind of products and innovation coming onto the market, which literally shows us how we can buy something that lasts for decades and replace components of that, and, you know, how much kind of waste it saves, can be a really useful starter point for conversations. I think we might wrap it up there. Actually, we're moving into a break prior to the next session. Damien, did you have any closing comments, or shall we just invite people to turn their cameras off and go grab a cup of tea or a drink of water?
Indeed, that sounds perfect. No, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for a great session, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes or just under at 10 past the hour. Thank you again, and a very big thank you to all of our panelists in that first session, Astrid Schumacher and Meredith Epp and Karen Robenhammer, and great moderating from Kate Noble. And really excitingly, we'll move now to panel discussion 2. What does circular economy look like in the Pacific? So our 3 speakers for this session will provide different perspectives on a circular economy for plastics in the Pacific region. Every region brings its own set of economic, social, and cultural realities to the challenge of circular economy transition, and that's certainly the case for our region. In this session, we'll aim to unpack what these are, how we can start to factor those in and leverage them to move to a more circular economy in the region. Our first speaker is Mike Richie, Managing Director of the MRA Consulting Group. Mike's one of Australia's leading waste experts with 25 years of experience in the environmental and waste sector. As a former senior executive for Visy, Suez and WSN, he's one of the sector's recognised strategic thinkers and regularly advises governments and business on waste and recycling. Mike's goal is to help make waste management economically rational and environmentally sustainable. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Damien. Appreciate it. Get the first slide. Thank you. My talk is a very short one, really just looking at the economics of a circular economy, and fundamentally our economics of waste management and circular economy as the general concept are broken, and landfilling and waste disposal, illegal disposal to the environment are kind of default options at the moment, and we need to fundamentally change that. Next slide. We have a very, very efficient economy, but it is mindless. It has no real policy settings around sustainability or the environment or circular economy, and it is broken at both ends. So we have a very much a take, make, landfill type model, and while that has been very efficient in raising economic standards across the planet, it's also been very efficient at degrading the environment. And particularly the circular economy is broken or will never be achieved because of 2 broken parts to our economy. The first is, as been mentioned before, the design side. What you put into the economy matters, and the recycling reuse component of the back end of the economy is also highly inefficient at delivering what we need. Now, of course, everyone's talked about circular economy being great for the economy. It's a jobs growth area. We employ 3 times more people in recycling than we do in landfilling. So, you know, there's no reason we shouldn't be promoting the circular economy. The issue is the barriers, and the primary barrier is the economics don't work. Either the economics of recycling or the economics for design. It's much cheaper to put something into the economy that you can use, take, make, and landfill. If landfill is the cheap option, then that's the least cost option for consumers. That's what they'll use. So until governments actually step up and say, well, we're going to regulate the space, both at the design side and at the reuse side, we're really having a heated debate about nothing, because we can't go forward. We'll always find the little trophy cabinet project that's a great idea that looks good and gets a front page story, but it won't systematically change the economy and drive system and structural change. Next slide. So we've seen this kind of diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the kind of how we create a linear, how we move from a linear economy to a circular economy. And the two bits that I say are completely broken at the moment that drive our linear economy are the design side is broken. Sure, we need to do a lot more work around production, manufacturing, distribution, and consumption reuse. I mean, we can tweak all of that space in the economy, but let's not forget the economy is pretty efficient at making stuff and distributing it. But the other part that is completely broken is the reuse and recycling side of the supply chain. So if we're going to focus on the highest priority actions, my view is you focus on the design side to make sure stuff is built for reuse, built for recycling, designed for longevity in the economy, that it's not just a simple use it once and chuck it away, like the coffee cups example that was used before. And secondly, that we have systems for recycling and driving that circular approach. Now, if we took that simple model and just focused on the two red arrows, we'd move a long way forward. Now, how to do that? Well, that's about government interaction. Fundamentally, only governments can regulate the requirements for design of materials going into the economy. For example, in Australia, there's not a single law in Australia that describes the type of material or the type and design of goods that can be sold into the economy. So we have laws for child safety, we have laws for pollution, we have laws for all sorts of things, but we don't have a law in Australia for the design of materials that can be sold into the economy. We have plenty of stuff at the back end, but nothing at the front end of the economy saying how stuff needs to be designed for reuse. Next slide. And this is, I think Kate asked the question before, what do we need to happen? What's the fundamentals? Where do you boil this down to? And I think that was the most important question, Kate. What do we have to do? Well, at the front end of the economy, we must have design rules for reuse and recycling, that you cannot sell a product into the economy unless you've thought about how it is reused or going to be recycled. And obviously, that gets harder the further you are from the producer or manufacturer of those goods. And the Pacific Islands in particular are a long way from the manufacturers of materials. But to the extent that they can control what's manufactured there in design rules, they should impose those. Similarly, they should be imposing import rules and import duties. If it's not able to be recycled, fair enough, we'll impose a duty on you to do advanced reprocessing or recycling or establish an extended producer responsibility scheme, or we'll simply tax you to compensate others to do that recovery work. Similarly, recycling labels, recycled content rules. We need to massively increase the recycling content of materials, and we need extended producer responsibility schemes. All of Australia's are voluntary, except for one co-regulatory arrangement. They need to be mandated. We need to get serious about the way we do extended producer responsibility. And at the back end of the economy, the economics are broken. It is still cheaper to landfill than to recycle most products in the Australian economy, and that is certainly true in the Pacific and all the work MRA Consulting has done in the Pacific. It's always true that you can landfill more cheaply than recycle. We need to build a collection system, and that means we need money. And the focus on collection should definitely be getting organics out of landfill, because that's the biggest greenhouse gas generator. We need landfill levies and bans on materials to landfill. We need government procurement rules. We need planning that facilitates infrastructure development and spending money on the bricks and mortar to drive recycling. And to the extent that I talked about some of those intermediate steps, we do need supply chain restructuring to make sure that we are driving materials to their highest and best use. Now, if I took that slide, I would say that's the next 5 years of work or 10 years of work to create a circular economy. They, for me, are the highest priorities. And of course, engaging with people and bringing people along on the journey is important. Next slide. So circular economy will not happen by itself. We can't innovate our way to a circular economy. It's about prioritising these issues. We need government leadership, and governments only have three levers. They can regulate, they can price, or they can educate. Unfortunately, they always go for education because the other two involve political leadership and cost. And I say we really need to do one and two. Circular economy, by definition, will be more expensive than landfilling until such time as we remove virgin product subsidies. So that is a key initiative, is to remove the subsidies on virgin product to re-equate recycled product with virgin material in terms of pricing. So governments really have to take the front foot on this. They need to change the economics or regulate or do both. Thanks very much, Damien.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike, for your opening remarks, and with really clear focus, firstly on design and then on reuse and recycling and what it will take to get things moving. I now call on Shalan Singh to give his opening remarks about composting as a circular economy example. Now, Shalan Singh is the Senior Health Inspector at Lautoka City Council in Fiji and has been with the council for around 20 years. He's also chair of the Pacific DWM Technical Working Group. And Shalan works with JICA, Ministry of Environment, recycling companies, and stakeholders right across the waste reduction and management sector, as well as on public awareness and engagement. Shalan, welcome.
Thank you, Damien, and thank you to SPREP for having me here. And I'd also like to thank the fellow panelists and all the participants who tuned in virtually to be part of this session on the circular economy. I have much pleasure to share the market waste composting initiative of the council, the Lautoka City Council, in terms of our move towards circular economy. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see the waste flow in terms of the flow of waste from the generation to the recycling and disposal. So as you can see in the waste flow, we're still not having the closed loop, but we're trying to close the loop. So you can see we have 2.4 tons of market waste being generated per day at our market. Out of that, we managed to recover 0.74 tons for composting, 0.9 is given for animal feed, and the rest goes for landfilling. So the 37% is the one we are trying to focus in terms of maximizing the separation to close the loop for the composting project. So far we've achieved 63% of resource recovery in terms of this project. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So in this slide, you can see the flow of the market waste composting project. So next slide. Can you go back to the previous slide, please? Can we return back to the okay. Yeah. So basically what we did was we did awareness for the vendors to do the separation, and then we did the loading and unloading at the site, and then in the site you can see the items being further separated at the landfill site for composting purposes in terms of removing the inorganics from the organics for shredding. Next slide. Okay, so you can see the shredding machine, and then we do the composting. So in this slide, you can see the trend, our achievements from year 2011 to now. So on an annual basis, we managed to recover and recycle around 270 tons of organic waste for the purpose of composting, and the line at the bottom shows the sales of compost, the market compost that we managed to sell. So for instance, in year 2020, we managed to recover 270.7 tons of market organics, and then we managed to sell 17.4 tons of market compost to the citizens of Lautoka. So you can see the bar is moving upwards, and we are trying to achieve more separation in terms of market waste composting. Next slide. Okay, In this slide, we can share the benefits of implementing the market waste composting project for the council from the year 2011 to this year. So the total tons of market waste being separated for composting was 2,172 tons. So, and we managed to sell 121 tons of compost from year 2011. And that helped us in terms of the saving the landfill management cost at the rate of $12.49 per ton. So it came up to $27,000. And the revenue we generated from the sales of compost was $36,000. And that too at a very minimal rate of $300 per ton, which might be cheapest in the world. So if we sell at $1,000 per ton, we can get more revenue, but we're just trying to promote, it's not to make money. So total benefit is about $63,000 so far from the year 2011. Next slide. So in this slide, we're trying to share the benefit of implementing the resource recovery efforts through the promotion of 3Rs. So this is an example of last year, 2020, in terms of all the 3R approaches that we are implementing in Lautoka. So the first one is in terms of paper, plastics, metals, and using the waste pickers. So in 1 year, we managed to recover 370 tons. So we can see the benefit in terms of the savings in the landfill cost. And for the market waste composting, as I've explained, and for animal feed and home composting. So far in Lautoka, there are about 500 citizens who are doing home composting at household level. So that is something we are promoting. So by doing that, we can recycle 97 tons in a year, just purely at site, at homes. And we can save the landfill cost in terms of transportation and landfilling, 1,200. So total amount being recycled in Lautoka for last year was around 1,074 tons. So if we equate that in terms of the total benefit from the savings in landfill management cost and income from sales of market compost, it comes to about $18,644. So we can see that by implementing 3R, we can recover a lot of waste materials for the purpose of recycling, either to composting or return to the other countries. Thank you. Next slide. So we would like to thank JACA and SPREP and all the donor agencies for helping us in the implementation of the composting project in Lautoka, whereby we're able to recover the waste for the purpose of recycling. I know it's a small project, but it does make a change. And if we do in the Pacific, there are other nations which also have markets whereby we can also do similar project to recover all the organic waste. And you know, when organic waste goes to landfill site, it creates a lot of nuisance in terms of litter generation and other things. So this is one project that we can easily do in the Pacific in terms of recycling. And thank you all. Naka.
Thank you, Shalin, for your presentation, showing us all the progress that you've achieved in organics and composting. And I appreciate you sharing the numbers on the tons and costs and benefits, which really helps us to get a good feel for what's involved. I'm now going to invite Jack to give his presentation about waste reduction and management in relation to the Pacific Games. And we'll look to how individual organisations and major events can play a really leading role in circular economy transition. Jack Smith is an event manager with more than 10 years of experience operating sporting events around the world. He has more than 5 years of experience in the Pacific, having worked at the 2017 Pacific Mini Games in Vanuatu, the 2018 Commonwealth Games in Australia, and the 2019 Pacific Games in Samoa. He's currently the Senior Manager for Venues and Game Services at the 2023 Pacific Games in Solomon Islands. Jack, you have the screen.
Thank you very much, Damien, and hello to everyone. Talofa lava, mahaloa. I'm very glad to be here and pleased to talk to you today about the circular economy and how it interacts with international sporting events. So I'm going to walk you through 3 events that I've been a part of here in the Pacific region. As Damien said, the Pacific Mini Games in Vanuatu in 2017, the Commonwealth Games in 2018 in the Gold Coast, and then in 2019 in Samoa. Then I'll finish up talking a little bit about the ways forward, lessons learned, and what we're trying to do differently in the future in order to jumpstart and fix some of the mistakes that we've made. The first thing I want to sort of share with everybody is sort of how these events work, because we operate a bit as a quasi-government entity. A majority of the funding for these events come from the governments that in the countries in which they're run. A portion of the funding, though, is raised separately through ticket sales, sponsorship, things like that. So, but a majority of it comes from the government, and we operate under all the regular rules, regulations of the governments of those hosting nations. But we do operate a little outside of it, which gives us some flexibility to do things sort of on an expedited level that may not be able to have been done sort of in the country as a whole. So first I want to talk about VAN 2017. So that's the Vanuatu Pacific Mini Games, which was hosted in the first week of December in Vanuatu. A couple of the initiatives that we implemented, we did a no single-use plastic bags for the entire event. So this included for our concessionaires, this included for any of our spectators who were coming in, as well as any of our contractors who provided services, whether that was cleaning or catering or things like that. And we did this in an effort to help the government see how that was possible. It was something that the government had been looking at doing. And so we figured we would take the first step to see how it would actually work. In addition to that, we did a private public partnership with a company called Azure Pure Water, one of the single-use plastic water bottle companies in Vanuatu, who instigated a buyback program for recycling, the first of its kind in Vanuatu, in which 5 Vatu was given back for every bottle that was returned. We also did a carbon offsetting program with our athletes and our team officials, in which we planted trees around the site and around Vanuatu in order to offset the carbon of athletes coming, the transportation carbon and things like that. We also worked on having biodegradable food containers. You know, in the Pacific, a lot of us know that styrofoams and plastics are a big use for takeaway containers. So we instigated a biodegradable food containers only for our catering contractors in order to be an industry leader and show that it was possible. We worked with our contractors to reduce cost, help them source these containers, and in the end, we didn't use a single styrofoam container for any of our food or any of our catering needs throughout the entirety of the games. And then the last thing, you know, we did a lot of education. As you'll see in both of the pictures, Nasi was our mascot. Nasi is a Nasi Viro, it's a bird in Vanuatu who went around the entire country, all 6 provinces, and promoted education in all the schools in order for kids to learn about recycling and not throwing away plastics or not burning plastics, and other ways in which we can reuse some of the things that in the villages we see every day. So those were some of the initiatives that we used in Vanuatu in 2017. And it was the first event that I had done, and I learned a lot about it and was able to take some of those lessons and use them in our future projects. So the second event I was part of was at the Commonwealth Games in 2018. Obviously a much bigger event in terms of budget and capacity than the Pacific Mini Games. And so I learned a lot of really unique things that Goldoc did. You know, at every stadium, there were water refill stations for athletes, staff and volunteers, and spectators. So spectators were encouraged to use and bring their own reusable water bottles in order to refill. And this was an initiative that was wildly successful and saved in excess of 2 million single-use plastic water bottles throughout the course of the games. Our organization also were committed to helium-free, straw-free, and single-use plastic bag-free games. So in any of the stores or consumer areas, none of these things were on offer, and through waste audits, we found that there was almost no straws or single-use plastic bags and helium balloons in the waste streams. One of the big things, and we've talked about it already, Kate brought it up before, was this takeaway coffee cup. And so as you'll see, even 4 years later, I'm still using this coffee cup from the Commonwealth Games in 2018. Every staff member received one of these. And as a result of that, they were able to make partnerships with private companies to provide discounts for people who had the Commonwealth Games reusable coffee cup, giving people an incentive to have it with them and to reuse it as often as possible. The Commonwealth Games also did a lot of public transit upgrades to reduce the carbon footprint and reduce the traffic in the areas. The games were not just in a single location, but covered all of Queensland. There were events in Brisbane, in Townsville, in Cairns, and in the Gold Coast. And anyone with an accreditation or a ticket was able to use public transit for free during the event time, which really helped reduce the amount of vehicles on the road and the amount of congestion that it created in the Gold Coast. And then the last thing, which was really interesting, is in the Games Village, most times when athletes come at an event like this, they'll get a towel every day. They'll get a reused towel every day. So in the Gold Coast, we asked athletes to treat it like a hotel, where if you were going to use it again, keep it on the hook. And we ended up reducing the number of towels that we washed by 33%. So it was a huge reduction in water usage and towel usage just by asking athletes to reuse it, as opposed to assuming that they needed a new towel every time. And then finally, in Samoa in 2019, this was one that was dear to my heart. And I know that the guys at SPREP, we worked a long time and did a lot of work on this event. Samoa was a last minute stand-in. So less than a year, we went from knowing we were going to host to hosting. So one of our big things is we wanted to be single-use plastic water bottle free. So we installed in excess of 350 reusable water stations, partnering with a couple of local companies who leased these water stations to us that were connected to municipal water. And then we gave every athlete, technical official, volunteer reusable water bottles that I'm still using today as well. And we saved in excess of 500,000 water bottles. And we worked with sports who, from the beginning, said that it wasn't possible for us to do it. They needed single-use plastic water bottles for doping or any other concerns, sports like triathlon and boxing. And we came up with some pretty unique and clever ideas in order to meet the sport regulation while also being true to the spirit of being a green games. The other thing we did is we used sustainable crockery and utensils. So at our big dining halls, we used ceramic plates and actual utensils rather than using single-use, throw away and send it to the landfill. So we required our caterers to provide for people dining in actual plates and utensils. And then for those that got delivery, we had sustainable plates and sustainable containers. We then worked with these caterers to source them and then provided duty and customs reductions in order to jumpstart their ability to purchase those items. We then also did a carbon offset program similar to what we did in Vanuatu, planting hundreds of trees around Samoa with the athletes and team officials. And then SPREP was really kind enough to provide reusable water bags for all of our teams that they use to carry around their items. And then we also gave some of those to our volunteers and staff as well, so that they weren't using single-use bags. So as we move forward, there are two big events coming up. So in the Northern Marianas Islands next year, and then the games that I'm involved in Honiara in 2023. And we really learned that in order for us to do this, we need really strong private-public partnerships, that we can't do it all, and that a lot of times the private, as long as we can provide some incentives, the private businesses can have some really good ideas of how to make some sustainable changes, such as the refillable water stations. The second thing that I've learned is, creating some really good procurement regulations and guidelines, because if we say that it has to be this, this, and this in terms of the kinds of plastic or where it's coming from or things like that, then there is no question about how we can, like what is expected of those companies or those contractors. And then the other piece is using these events to jumpstart this circular economy. A lot of times in the Pacific, we think it's just so expensive to make a change. But for an event like the Pacific Games, where we're going to have 5,000 to 6,000 people come to a country and consume more things and bring money into the economy, we can use it as a Kickstarter to show that it is possible, that the circular economy is possible, and to implement some of the goals that the country and the Pacific have. And that, to me, I've worked in other parts of the world and in other major events, and I think that the Pacific can be a leader, not a follower, in terms of setting the standard for what sustainability and the circular economy looks like as when it comes to international sporting events. And then I put this last line here. This is a quote that I really like to talk about, but to achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. So I say that for events because for us, there's always a deadline. We will always have opening ceremonies at a certain date. So we may not do it right all the time, but we have just not enough time to iron out all the details. So for us, it gives us a chance to try out new things on a large scale that maybe sometimes governments or localities are hesitant to do. With that, I'll send it back to you, Damien. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Thank you, Jack, for your presentation and sharing all your experiences with the games. Kate, over to you as we come to the Telenor Q&A session.
Thanks, and thanks so much to the panelists. There were three really great presentations. There's quite a bit of chat about compost in the chat, so I'm going to start there actually. And this is, we've got a couple of questions from participants. I'll jump to those in a sec. But Shalend, I just had a quick question about your chart, which showed seemed to show a bit of a dive in composting last year. Is that down to COVID, and how does that look to be recovering?
Yes, so as you know, from last year March, we had 1 month the market was closed, so we could not get the market vendors to come and be selling in the market. So we were not able to generate a lot of market organics for composting purposes. And likewise, this year too, our market was closed for a while from April and onwards. So that is why the start is going down. And for this year, the data is just up to October. So the 2 months still left to go.
Great, thanks. We had a question in the chat from Satoa Apo around design and really what kind of leverage Pacific governments have to influence that. I think Mike ended up touching on that. Satoa, was your question answered around looking at what the kind of levers are? So, Mike talked about, yes, there's not a whole lot of production that happens in this region of the world, but what can happen and what would be really impactful is regulating what comes into the countries, looking at design standards, and a whole other range that were included on that single slide. Satoa, did that answer your question if you're around?
Yeah, okay. I just want to compliment my brother Charlotte and Jack. It's good to see you, Jack. Yeah, it was quite an experience here in Samoa during the 2019 Pacific Games. It was challenging, but thank you, Jack. You were there for me, and then it was coincided with our plastic ban thing, single-use plastic, and it was instrumental. And my brother Sheldon, us in the Pacific, we work together, to do this. And I wish even Solomon Islands, if they are there, take that challenge. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Jack, I had a question for you. I think one of the interesting things you talked about, major events, sort of leadership in this space. And what's been really interesting in Australia is that some of the strong leadership on single-use plastics and increasing reusables has really come from local councils and then state and territory governments and then national governments. So I guess the question is around, you talked a bit about, protocols and standards that would be really helpful in supporting major events to do this, to do what you're doing. What exactly is it that you'd like to see sort of coming from various levels of government?
Well, I think, for me personally, like, what we like to do is we like to ask the governments, what are your goals? Where do you want to try to go? And what can we use this sort of microcosm event to pilot? Because you're going to have people who are experts in sustainability or greening or plastics or recycling that we're not. But so if there are some things that we want to try, let us try that. Like, let us, as a big event, be the leader and say, this worked, this didn't, and now we can move forward and have a better roadmap to what a long-term business as usual circular economy for recyclables and reuse looks like.
Thanks very much. Mike, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, that sort of characterization of, in Australia, sort of some of the leadership coming from local councils, then state and territories, followed by national government. Do you think that's an accurate reflection? And can you point to anything that you think has been particularly useful?
I think historically that's right. Local governments have been empowered to do stuff. The state governments in Australia have basically been hands off waste. It's really only since 2018 when all the state, federal and local governments signed up to the National Waste Action Plan. And getting that consolidated view that the ship of state is heading towards recycling, circular economy, driving down waste. That's the first time in Australia's history that we've had that kind of alignment. And I honestly think that that was revolutionary and transformative, because we still up until then had councils, governments saying, yeah, but hold on, landfill is cheap. Let's just do more of it because it's good for the economy. That is a sea change, that when you get governments to actually line that. I mean, I would say that's something for the Pacific to do, is just to get all governments to say, no, we don't want cheap disposal at landfill anymore. And we're going to start taxing landfill to start adjusting that landfilling costs suddenly become more expensive than the cost of recycling. And until we fix that, fundamentally, we are having a lend of ourselves. We're just dreaming that we're going to get a circular economy. Whenever we allow landfills just to indiscriminately suck stuff in, they're just like big vacuum cleaners. They just suck resources in indiscriminately. And the cheaper they are, the more suction they have. So I think local government kind of got onto that early on. I think with Trevor Evans, and we now have a national minister for waste and recycling, first time ever. So I actually think that the federal government is starting to lead in a lot of these spaces. With this particular government has really interested in waste and recycling and circular economy. So I'm full marks to them, and that has brought some of the states up. So we now really, for the first time, have seen some decent alignment around policy, not going nearly fast enough, not going anywhere near achieving greenhouse gas targets of zero net emissions by 2050. Waste in Australia represents about 15% of net aggregate emissions. It's a huge part of a solution. And it was really nice to see Shalene talking about organics, because that's really the low-hanging fruit. That's dead simple for everyone in the Pacific. If you are landfilling organics, you are on the wrong path. Get it out, get it composted, and get it reused in agriculture. And if we did that in the next 2 years, that would be a major step forward towards circularising our economies, because it's 50% of the waste we send to landfill in Australia. It's more in the Pacific. So that, if we were just going to do one thing, let's focus on organics for the next 2 years and get it out of landfill.
Great. Let's end there on a top tip from Mike. composting and organics. It is break time. Thank you so much to Mike, Shelland and Jack for some great presentations and a great discussion. We will break for 10 minutes and see you all back shortly.
Thank you, and indeed a very warm welcome back. We're now going into our panel 3 discussion, how to achieve circular economy in the Pacific. And this final session really aims to bring the issue of circular economy home and look to the future of a circular economy transition in the region. Our first speaker is Mr. Kosi Latu, Director General of the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, SPREP, which is the premier intergovernmental agency for the Pacific environment. SPREP has 26 member governments and works across a range of issues, including climate change, resilience, island and ocean ecosystems, waste management and pollution control, and environmental monitoring and governance. Mr. Latu has led a distinguished career as the SPREP Director General since 2016, SPREP Deputy Director General from 2008 to 2015, and as the Special Legal Advisor and Head of the Legal and Economic Division. Prior to that, he held senior roles with the Commonwealth Secretariat and the United Nations Office for Project Services Financial Compliance Program at the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Kosi, you have the screen.
Thank you very much, moderator, for that introduction. And also like to just acknowledge other panelists that are joining us today. I've listened with great interest to the previous panel, and I think there's some really interesting points that were made that I think nicely linked to this panel. I'd like to start off, I guess, with obvious when we're talking about the circular economy here in the Pacific, and particularly looking at the governance dimensions of it. I think we can safely start off by saying that the current waste paradigm here in the region, I guess, is reflected by one of importation and consumption and disposal. And the work of the governments in the first instance in this regard cannot be overemphasized in terms of bringing a change to that dimension and making sure that we do shift from a linear to a circular economy. For the most part, many of our countries in the region import things that I think can be substituted by our own local production and means. We continue to import these items, and I think we can certainly look at ways of capturing and recovering, and of course, reusing and recycling. I guess to follow on from that, in terms of the topic, I want to sort of underline the need for us to, I guess, look at some of these. What are some of these factors in terms of changing that, paradigm, bringing about that paradigm shift? What are some of the factors that we need to address? It was very interesting just noting some of the really useful interactions that have been happening in the last couple of days, particularly with the technical sessions. I wanted to just pick up on some of those important points, but I think they're relevant for our panel. And of course, the first thing that needs to happen is obviously a change in the legislative environment as an enabling mechanism. And it's here we're talking about not just legislation, but also policy. These things obviously go together. So the need to have that legislative environment that enables and incentivizes. And I think we've heard that many times in the last couple of days, in particular in the very useful interactions that we've heard and seen during the technical sessions. And also disincentives in terms of movement towards the landfill and making sure that we're ending those products that have an end of life dimension. Secondly, I think, again, this is a point that we're picking up from the technical discussions, and that is an enabling environment that recognizes the significant role, I think, of industry in the private sector and institutions that are vital to, in partnerships with governments. Vital in the sense that they bring their skills, they bring their experience and their expertise. Technology, of course, and the capacity to finance and to be able to deliver on quality outcomes. I think, again, this is a point that's been highlighted in the last couple of days. But I think that if we are talking about a governance commitment to enabling a circular economy, that is certainly a key, I think, dimension in terms of this changing paradigm and the kind of factors that we need to look at. Then the other important point I want to mention as part of these key factors is, of course, the engagement of the community. And we've had some good examples from some of the smaller Pacific Island countries, such as Tuvalu and Palau, where our communities have been very engaged, very active as part of this shift to a circular economy. But it's getting the getting the community engaged and involved in understanding the choices that consumers need to make. This is something that still requires, I think, in the Pacific, a lot more work in terms of awareness. I think there's some work that is there, but I think a lot more work needs to happen, particularly when it comes to the Pacific way of life. Food consumption and production, those kind of things are very, very important. And people need to understand the kind of choices that they can make that can bring about a difference in terms of this issue. I wanted to also just perhaps maybe just cite some examples of some good work that some of our key partners have done in the region. The European Union, for example, and the Australian government have carried out some really good work in some of our Pacific countries in the region, where we're beginning to see some impact in terms of changes. Some of this work has also been very useful in terms of identifying not just the challenges, but of course, opportunities. So again, I'm just referring to the discussions from the technical sessions last week, which I think have been very helpful in actually progressing our discussion up to this point. And I mentioned in my earlier comment that the need for a legislative environment, but I think we need to kind of drill that down a bit and start looking at dedicated national legislation that seeks to address effective waste management. Often this needs to include incentives, as I mentioned. Dimensions such as licensing become important. The promotion of waste minimization and cost recovery. These are all very important factors when it comes to looking at specific dedicated legislation that seeks to address waste management issues and so forth. Waste financing, I think we're seeing this in a number of the smaller countries. Palau, for example, we're seeing it in Kiribati, Tuvalu, with the container deposit levy being applied in similar ways that I think we're seeing some positive outcomes. We've also seen right throughout the region a common practice where many of our countries are now putting in place common bans on single-use plastics, which is, of course, our major concern. Talking about legislation, I think one of the things that obviously I'd like to mention, which came out of the technical discussions last week, is we think that when we develop a piece of legislation, that's the answer, that's it. And it may well be that a good piece of legislation will address some of these issues. But I guess that we need to be careful about making sure that we start getting into issues such as identifying exactly what you mean by waste, because I think that's important in terms of issues that continue to change over time. A certain waste dimension may change because of the changing trends of consumption and so forth. So these legislation that we're putting in place not only need to focus specifically on waste management, but I guess it's got to be flexible, dynamic in the sense that it needs to anticipate, I guess, new developments in the future. Compliance and enforcement, well, I mean, I think that's obvious. We've seen in the region some legislation which seek to address waste management that have been hampered mainly because of the lack of compliance and enforcement. And of course, if you have legislation that's not enforced, that's not going to work. So one of the things that I think many of our Pacific Island countries that have legislation that look at waste management issues is the fact that we've got to make sure that it works. And to make it work, it needs to be enforced and that there is effective compliance. Now, of course, when we're talking about legislation in the region, we need to be thinking of the cultural context of each of the different countries. The political differences, of course, are there. You know, when you talk about Federated States of Micronesia, you're talking about a state system. There are different states within that setup, and so one has to be thinking about the context, the cultural aspects to it, and also the capacity issues that come with it. Public-private partnerships, well, you can't, I really think that this is one of the key, well, one of the most important, I think, issues when you're talking about trying to bring about a paradigm shift. This is a key factor, and that is we need to not only bring in the private sector, but we need to have effective partnerships where we can not only bring in the private sector because they have the skills and experience, but that we're having these Samoa partnership. It's been mentioned early on in the beginning of the Cleaner Pacific Roundtable, and we did have a presentation earlier last week on this. But this is one of those partnerships that seem to be working, and I think we need to see a lot more of these partnerships, hopefully in the future. Let me just conclude by saying that we, of course, the work that we're seeing at the national level, particularly in the Pacific, is ongoing. We like to see a lot more of our countries, take steps that will enable them to, make that shift from a linear economy to a circular economy. I mentioned some of the smaller Pacific Island countries that have put in place container deposit levies, which are working. And I know that several other countries are now beginning to move that direction. We want to see more of that. We want to see more of the community engagement. We want to see more of the private sector partnerships and legislation that's not just dedicated to waste management issues, but in fact, anticipate some of these trends as you move into the future. Let me conclude then with that, and thank you again, moderator, for the opportunity, and look forward to my other colleagues for their interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kosi, and for all the important work that you and your team at SPREP have underway. Let's move now to our second speaker. Taufia Patolo is the Secretary of Ministry of Local Government and Agriculture, Government of Tuvalu. He'll be speaking about how Tuvalu legislation can provide an enabling environment for a circular economy transition. Taufia, over to you.
All right, Tuvalu has developed and enacted a couple of very powerful and transformative legislations in the form of the waste management, which is the prohibition on the importations of single-use plastic regulation 2019, as well as the waste management levy deposit regulation. And both of these regulations were issued under the Waste Tuvalu Act. The waste management on the prohibition on the importation of single-use plastic was effective on the 1st of August 2019, with 9 selected single-use plastics items banned from importation. Given Tuvalu's status that we don't manufacture plastics, obviously the government decided that we start banning the importations of plastics. And this includes water bottles for those below the 1.5 liter, plastics for ice blocks and a few other lists. Due to the sudden implementations or the rolling out of the legislations, the government decided to give a grace period of 6 months. That started from February up to November 2020, whereby it allows businesses with the stock of plastics they have imported, they already in the country, to be able for them to sell or to use, given that they most of the importers have imported quite a large number of those plastics. But on the 1st of December last year, there was a complete ban. And this ban goes to the importation, the selling, distribution, as well as the usage. So that came into effect on the 1st of December last year. But to cushion this, because of the change, people are used to plastics. There were a number of initiatives initiated just to look at what are the local alternatives where people can use to substitute the use of plastics. The other legislation that was initiated and already implemented by government was the waste management, the levy deposit. Again, it came into effect on the 1st of August 2019 with 3 items started off with. And this includes cans, the plastics. But then on the 1st of April last year, another 3 items were added to that list, which include nappies, batteries. So up until now, and since the inception of this act, only the aluminum cans and plastic drink bottles are being refunded, 50% of the total levy that are paid up front. And the initiatives that the waste department has started off is a recycling by way of aluminum cans, as well as the plastic, the bottles. And the bottles that I'm talking about here is obviously the big ones for 1.5 liter. We stopped importations of drinking bottles less than 1.5. So these are the very, in terms of the enabling environment for circular economy, we started off by putting in place the relevant legislations. And there are a number of policies that goes together with the legislations. What are the achievements of these legislations and what we have seen since the enactment of both of these legislations? One, it certainly assists with reducing the litter, public litter on the islands. And given Tuvalu, with its small size, we don't have much land area for dump sites. We've certainly noticed a drop in the litter because of the importations, the banning of the single-use plastic. The other one that we've noticed is the enhanced level of public. And it is important that the public and government has a good relationship, a partnership on this. And there's been a significant increase in the know-how and the level of knowledge, not only within government, the private organizations, but as well as the island communities on the implications on the importance of waste and why government is initiating such legislations. In the third one, with the levy being charged, with imposed, there are some additional revenues being generated by government. What are the challenges that Tuvalu face in terms of these legislations? And the biggest hurdle that we've slowly overcome over the number of years is the level of acceptance, is the public acceptance, both by the private as well as businesses. With the up until now, people are starting to realize the importance of these legislations and why Tuvalu moved to have these legislations in place. But right at the outset, it was a public outcry. People will not understand, and therefore they were making their voices heard to the government on why we are stopping the importations of plastics. So that was the biggest challenge. And it took courage, commitment, and a firm commitment by government as well as the department to ensure that the level of advocacy programs, awareness, continuously deliver to enable the people of Tuvalu understand. The second challenge that we notice is the monitoring of old stock. Given that there have been a number of importers bringing in their stocks, it is important, and this was a challenge, that we ensure that we stopped further importations right at the border entry. And at the same time, we monitor and we control the recycling and the usage, especially after the 1st of December last year, because there were cases where businesses still have old stock, and following the 1st of December last year, it is important, and that was a challenge, just to ensure that we completely stop those businesses from reusing or selling those plastics which are currently already in the country. And the third challenge is, again, is the control and the monitoring of these banned plastic items in private homes. There were community gatherings, churches, schools, and at times we tend to notice that there are people still using their plastic items. So this is, again, it's one of the challenges that we're currently facing, and we have faced, and we are overcoming those challenges. And the last ones that I wanted to share at this point in time, the lessons learned, and I think it is important. What are the lessons that Tuvalu has learned, which potentially could help other countries looking at doing similar kind of legislations? The first one that I wanted to share is adapting to changes require patience and commitment. It is critical, it is vital that patience and commitment are present, are there, just to ensure that you go with the flow, you allow people to voice their concerns, and you have to make sure that you have the patience by way of explaining, running advocacy, awareness programs, and it is absolutely critical, patience and commitment. The other one is the importance of organizing nationwide consultations. It is important that all the stakeholders are very much involved right from the outset. And I think one of the lessons that we learned, perhaps some of the key stakeholders were not involved at the early stage. They only came into the equations when the legislation are being implemented. That creates a bit of, complaints and issues. But I think it's important that if we are to come up with a new legislations of this similar kind of initiatives, then it is critical that nationwide consultations, everyone, key stakeholders are involved, so that their views are heard when it comes to the developing and drafting the new legislations. Their views and their concerns, their suggestions, they should form the impetus of drafting the new legislations. The third one, which is again already touched by a few speakers, the political commitment. We found a strong political commitment and will to go through and determination to see out this, it won't work. Because it is important that the political commitment is there to be able to see the fruit of the legislations. And finally, with this kind of legislation, it is important in our view that incremental changes, that we implement this in incremental, bit by bit, as opposed to one big bang approach, whereby you just start throwing everything and start doing right from the word go. But I think it is important that you think big, but you make sure that you take baby steps at a time, just to allow time for customers and all the key stakeholders to be on the same page. And I think that's where I wanted to end here. And I wanted to acknowledge the work that SPREP has done in the region, as well to Tuvalu in supporting all these initiatives related to waste, as well as achieving the circular economy. I'll leave it here. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Taufia, for sharing your experiences of recent successes in Tuvalu, and indeed challenges which we can all learn from. So our final speaker today is Mr. Stefan Awadra, head of the UNEP Pacific office based in Apia, Samoa. He's also the incoming SPREP Director General and will start in April 2022. From Fiji, with a background in environmental engineering, management and policy, Stefan joined UNEP in June 2015 and has worked in the environment sector in the Pacific Islands for over 30 years. including at the Secretariat for the Pacific Regional Environment Programs PREP for 10 years in 2 stints, 1999 to 2006 as Marine Pollution Advisor, and from 2010 to May 2015 as Director, Environmental Monitoring and Governance Division. Stefan and I will be discussing global and regional level plastic commitments as an example of how these can support circular economy efforts. Sefa, welcome. You have the screen.
Thank you, fellow panelists. Like Kosi earlier, I really appreciated the discussion and during those earlier panels. When Tony asked me on Friday to do this, he asked that I focus more on the global process or the global negotiation process. I have a longer PowerPoint slide that I can share with you separately if people are interested, that gives a fuller picture. What comes across over the last few days and also reading some of the articles in the local newspaper regarding COP26 is that not many people really understand the intergovernmental negotiation process. It's a process you really have to be involved with to fully understand. It's not something that you do at the COPs only or at the various big meetings. Most of the negotiation is done in the back rooms intersessionally. So I think that's the first point I'd like to make. So when we work on an issue like marine litter or trying to get a legal instrument on marine litter, you can't wait until you have the negotiating session. The work has to go in before, well before. And that's what this slide illustrates. So the work on this towards a marine litter instrument started through UNEA in 2014. Maybe I should take a step back. UNEA itself is a new thing, or the UN Environment Assembly. It was put in place in 2012 at the Rio +20 conference. There was a bid then for UNEP to become a specialized agency of the UN. This was not approved by the UN member states, but what they agreed was to improve or make the governance of UNEP more participatory by members. So this is why the UN Environment Assembly was set up, and we had the first session in 2014. It complements the UN General Assembly that happens in New York, which everyone I'm sure is aware of, or the head conference of the UN as a whole. Since then, we've had 4 UNEAs, and the issue of marine debris and marine plastics has progressed throughout those 4 UNEAs. We are now working towards UNEA 5.2. One of the impacts of COVID is that UNEA 5 had to be done in 2 sessions. UNEA 5.1 has been done already, and that concentrated only on the admin and budgetary requirements of UNEP. UNEA 5.2 will be in February, March 2022, and that will consider all the substantive resolutions and issues that have been raised from UNEA 4. Below the arrows that you have there are other resolutions that have been put forward through UNEA that have some sort of relationship with this marine litter issue, or marine litter instrument that we are working towards. The reason I raise this is because you can't really treat these things in isolation. They are all related. Next slide, please. Okay, outside of this, okay, let me take a step back. There is another body that exists within UNEP, which is a representational body called the Committee of Permanent Representatives. That committee is the one that that does most of the negotiation and arrangements because they meet intersessionally. The problem for us in the Pacific is that we don't have member states that have representation in Nairobi. So we are not party to a lot of these discussions. What we have tried to do is to organize for Pacific countries to nominate their representatives on this committee to be from the New York missions, where a lot of the Pacific states are represented, so that they can, so we can be represented in the negotiation process. So far, only 4 countries have taken this step: Fiji, Samoa, Palau, and FSM. I'm currently working with them to try to get them formalized within the Secretariat. This is different from the UNEP focal point, which exists for all countries and the environment ministries in each country. This is a key step, I think, that that many Pacific countries need to take in order to effectively engage, because essentially the negotiations process is only the countries. It's not SPREP, it's not UNEP, it's not anyone else. So the countries have to be the ones who take the lead. This slide shows many of the other things that are happening on the sidelines that will help this process go forward, including our Pacific Declaration on Marine Data. Can you go back, please? The key one there is that the appetite for marine litter instrument is growing. There's 65 countries that endorsed it in a ministerial statement, but we still need a lot of work to do because there's 190 plus UN member states. So we don't have a majority yet. Next step, please. Next slide, yep. So the next thing we need to do is to make sure we get our concerns into the draft resolutions that will be going to UNEA 5.2. Getting a Pacific resolution now will be hard, almost impossible. So no use going down that route. What we need to do is just look at those 1 and 2 that we have there and see which one more closely matches the declaration that we've got from the Pacific, and choose that this is the resolution that we will be supporting during the negotiation process that will happen leading up to UNEA 5.2. The next step, if we are successful in getting the draft resolution approved at UNEA 5.2, will be the formation of a diplomatic negotiating conference. This is the body that will negotiate the actual text of the instrument. And that itself too is not a fast process. It may take a number of years. When we negotiated the CBD and the UNFCCC in the early 90s, we had 13 from memory INCs for UNFCCC, and I think 15 or 16 for CBD. So, and it took place over 2-3 years. So it's not a fast process. I just want to raise that so people are fully aware of what it takes to put these things in place. Next slide, please. I think there's one. Yep. And these are things that we're doing right now to try and help with the circular and blue economy transformation. I have a few more in the other presentation that I've got that I can share. But what I'd like to pick on is what one of the panelists before raised, Mike from MRA Consulting. I think with all this talk about blue economy, green economy, circular economy, what a lot of us are doing, and all of us are guilty of this, we confuse the people we're trying to convince. Because really what we're talking about is economic transformation. The way we get there is what we spend too much time twiddling over. The actual instruments for doing it are the same as outlined before, and they're quite simple and they won't change over time. So I think maybe we have too much time to consider the different things, people like us who don't work on the ground. What we need to be thinking of is the government people who are the ones who are going to make the change. They want it given to them in the simplest format that they can take to actually do the action. I think that's where we need to step back and really look at how we're doing things and try and serve the people we're meant to be serving. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, for your presentation. Really gave us an important window into the mechanisms involved in global commitments and frameworks. And certainly, personally, I'm looking forward to a very exciting Telenor and Q&A session. And I'm pleased now to hand over to Kate.
Thanks very much. And I just wanted to follow up on some of Stefan's really good points on the nature of the negotiation process in relation to a global agreement on plastic pollution. Now is a really important time to be influencing this process, not at UNEA 5.2 in February. And I think, everyone on this call, every individual, every citizen, every company, every government, whether it's from local through to national level, has a potential role to play in encouraging our own governments to take a really decisive position on a global agreement. There's incredibly strong support right across the Pacific at national government level for this process, probably amongst the strongest of any region in the world. But what would be great is to see that translating into co-sponsorship of the Peru-Rwanda resolution, which is the stronger draft resolution on the table. And we're yet to see that. So if there's any appetite in the room for putting your hand up and influencing that process and influencing and engaging governments on that issue, absolutely, that now is a great time to do that. We do have a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to go to. Patricia Parkinson posed a great question on compliance and enforcement of single-use plastic bans. And this is a question for any of the panelists in terms of whether anyone's aware of strategies or actions that have helped in the shift away from plastic bags, plastic or styrofoam containers in a sustainable way, sort of over the long term. So looking at specific measures that have been particularly successful. Talfia, maybe I could come to you first on that.
Thank you, Kate, for that question. I think from a small country perspective, such as Tuvalu, I think over the long term, looking at how to get a sustainable way of dealing with plastics. Part of the initiatives that we're looking at right now is promoting our local products, and we feel that it goes a long way towards ensuring that the people of Tuvalu, we don't really feel the impact of losing out on the use of plastics, so to say, by way of there are a number of local initiatives, local products that perhaps we can encourage and promote within Tuvalu that obviously substitute, and probably their longevity is more durable than the plastics that we use. And we are starting to see a number of initiatives being coming to to light at this point in time in terms of people coming up with ideas or suggestions with their new products, which can obviously substitute plastics in the long run. And one of it, the other initiatives we're looking at, and given Tuvalu, we don't really trade. We're not a trade country. We are very much an imported reliant country. So we don't really have that issue in terms of looking at plastics in terms of packaging our products to be traded to our neighboring countries. But in the long run, down the line, who knows, there could be a potential for that. But in the meantime, most of our works and our initiatives are currently in place. It's just looking at substitute alternatives which can substitute the use of plastics in Tuvalu. So to me, that is more sustainable in terms of promoting local products.
Thanks so much. And just sticking with you, Tofia, we had a question from Andrea Vidal at the EU office in Fiji. Do you have any numbers of the revenue generated with the waste levy to date? And will this be spent for further improvements in the waste management sector?
Thank you for that question. I think it's good to get the questions coming from EU, given that the EU has very much supported our waste sector over the past 7 years. But yes, compare the figures, the total revenue that we collected last year in 2019, we were looking at about close to 90K. But then 2020, we surpassed a 200K total revenue collected from levy. So that's a significant increase. And we feel that if we start adding on new items on the list to be levied, obviously that will correlate with an increase in total revenue. One of the things that we are working with the Ministry of Finance at this point in time is to ensure that part of these funds are directly spent on waste-related activities. And to do that, we're working on setting up a special fund which enable a portion of the total collection to be put aside rather than all consolidated into the government basket of funds. We're sitting with the Ministry of Finance, but to have a special fund purposely set up to be administered by the ministry and the department so that it gets a portion out of the total receipts to be spent directly on various waste initiatives. So that's currently what we're working on. So it's in the pipeline.
Thanks so much, Tofia. In a few minutes, I'm going to hand back to Damien for some concluding comments. But first, I'd like to go to the SPREP room, to the incoming and outgoing Directors General. I'd like to hear from you guys, 5 years from now, if you could look back, hopefully, Cozy, you'll be kicking back and enjoying some sunshine and a nice drink. But 5 years you're looking back on now, and can you identify one or two kind of fundamental changes in terms of a shift to a circular economy that you would like to see have taken place? And I guess you can answer this on a kind of a regional level, global level, or in relation to a specific country.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I like to think that in 5 years I'll be retired and relaxing on some beach, but I doubt that very much. I wanted to just cite the example of container deposit levy in Samoa, because 20 years ago, well, actually more than 20, I was involved in the discussions of that. That is still being discussed. And we've had various governments come in, out and out. And there seems to be a consensus that this needs to be done. And I think that for Samoa in particular, I think they really need to move on that and action it as soon as possible, because I think the opportunities that it presents in terms of shifting away from a linear economy to circular economy, I think for me they're obvious. It just needs to be done. But the progress has been very slow. I'm not quite sure why. I've been following up with the national entity for the environment, and it all seems positive. But I think that once they do that, then I think we will begin to see an even greater engagement with the private sector. The National Waste Associations are very, very active here, and we're beginning to see that in some of the countries. So the private sector is not waiting. They are moving ahead. They're not waiting for government. So I think government needs to really pick up the pace and really start actioning some of these very important changes that need to happen. And you're talking about 5 years. I think that I'm hoping this will happen before 5 years, and that the impact, if that eventuates, I think will certainly extend beyond the 5-year period. And then, of course, just maybe while I have the floor, we've got to do something about, it's all we're talking. We heard earlier on about this heavy reliance on importation, and that's what characterizes us in the region. It's one-way traffic. Something needs to change in terms of that system where everything comes into the Pacific, very little leaves the region. And I think that's a very fundamental issue that needs to change. And I think it begins with changing our thinking in terms of what we really do need, and bringing an influence in terms of consumer choices. Do we really need to import this stuff? And, can we look at some of the, local substitutes? And it is possible. So I think that issue needs to be changed, and hopefully we can start seeing some knock-on benefits that will come from it. But at this moment, it's still there. But I'd like to really see a fundamental shift in terms of that.
Thanks so much, Kosi. Stefan?
Thank you, Kosi. Hopefully 5 years' time, I'll still be here. But for me, I think there's three things I'd like to do within those 3 years. First is to make sure we here at SPREP assisting the countries the way we should in negotiations, and also setting up the national platforms for national implementation, whether it's legal policy, the economic instruments, the social stuff that needs to happen to engage. The second thing is that we do a better job of being the good technical lens for the region. The reason I say that is I see the same mistake happening all the time. You can take, let's say, sustainable land management. Then it became integrated land management. Then it became reach to reef. Then it became something else. I understand why it happens that way, because it makes it attractive for donors to put money in and all that. But somebody has to be there to help the countries to do it in, because all we're doing is 5 years' time, it's such and such. So the country will come up with a plan for sustainable land management or blue economy or green economy. Then in another 3 years, they're required to do a plan on green growth. Another few years, so it's really confusing for many countries. So I think the role for somebody like SPREP is to play that facilitator, mediator, taking and working with the countries to make sure that they're continuing on the progress on the transformation that needs to happen. And then the third is the finance and resourcing aspect. Finance, funding, and resourcing, and providing the technical expertise that's required, not necessarily from SPREP itself, but from its wider partners, whether they be academic institutions or research institutions, NGOs. And we have the elements of that partnership already here with like the Cleaner Pacific and Nature Conservation Roundtable. So we just need to align it better. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stefan. Thanks to the panelists for this session, and indeed to the panelists from the whole afternoon. I'm going to hand back to Damien now for some concluding comments.
Thank you. Thank you again, panelists, and to Kate. And it's a great pleasure now to draw together with what's been a fantastic series of sessions this afternoon. And just to recap, and we began hearing from Joss from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation about the importance of a circular economy, that it will help us live within planetary boundaries. And indeed, it's about eliminating waste and pollution, circulating products at their highest level, and regenerating natural systems. One of the statistics that stood out was him mentioning the important role in the order of 45% of, in terms of the way we use materials, playing in being able to reduce carbon emissions, in addition to the energy sector, which has been an understandable primary focus of emissions reductions. He asked us to think about switching from depleting resources to creating capital in a circular economy and new conceptualizations of value. We heard then from Astrid, who reiterated that triple problem we're facing of climate, biodiversity loss, and pollution, and what's being done in the Circular Economy Action Plan, and really the progress that's been made, the maturing of the discussion, and again, the importance of being regenerative, of design, and including aspects now like the right to repair. And we didn't spend much focus in the panel discussion talking about it, but we're starting to see even now big companies like Apple talking about repair, which I think was unheard of until very recently. So we are seeing progress, and we need to make sure that at the systems level and across contexts, that's coordinated to a common goal. And it was great to hear emphasised that the sharing of the EU experience in partnerships beyond Europe is very much something they'll be pleased to extend. On the theme of partnerships, Meredith from APCO, the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, continued that sentiment and brought out the importance of collaboration for collective action, and using the example of the ANZPAC Plastics Pact here in our region. And then changing the scale again, we heard from Karen insights into progress on a global agreement. And it sets up, I think, nicely the importance of actions at different scales to get to really a circular economy, which will be something we can be proud of. Mike, with great clarity, honed in on the importance of getting the design stage of the circular economy system right, the economics right to support reuse and recycling. We heard from Charlene about the organics out of landfill case in Fiji, and as Mike was saying too, it's low-hanging fruit and will support circularity and makes it such a great example. It has certainly an impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but makes for a tangible example to build familiarity with the concept of circular economy and how it can be delivered on the ground. And it is important that we are always coming back to those tangible examples, that it's not a buzzword or a high-level concept. It actually is a catalyst for lived change in our communities, in our countries, and our region. Now, Jack showed us how big events, the games, can raise awareness and also be catalysts for showcasing innovation, for sharing lessons, and for building over time on both successes and failures. And I think we sometimes sideline some of the things that haven't worked as well, but they too can be really important in helping us take that next step. And it is an evolution, this progress towards circular economy. But as Kossi brought home, it is indeed as well a paradigm shift. And that to be successful, we really also do need that community engagement for us to get there together. And furthermore, success has many faces, from regulation to public-private partnerships to extended producer responsibility, such as the container deposit legislation. And Taufia showed really eloquently what can be achieved with courage and political commitment through the example of the waste levy. And as Sefa said, the time is now for working to progress towards UNEA 5.2. Indeed, today's discussion and what we can take from today will not only contribute to the final outcome statement here, but we can draw on as inspiration as we look ahead to UNEA 5.2 next year, and also the Our Oceans Conference. And that we really do seek to aim for a future that the next generation will thank us for. One of the key messages for me is that governance and commitment to circular economy is key, reiterating that spans right from the local council, as we heard with the composting and organics in Fiji, through to national regulations of circular economy, whether that's in Europe or in Tuvalu, as we heard with the waste levy, and through to the global stage. And we have really strong support that we've heard here today from Pacific governments for a treaty, and a stronger stance be welcome on marine litter and plastic pollution. And in closing, for me, it feels like the things that I'll take away are having that courage to aim high, that we work mindful of the context, just along with the community to transition together, and that the collaboration is going to be so important in getting the finance right, in getting the legislation and the settings right that can be supportive. But if we continue and we share lessons, then it gives us a basis for renewing our courage and celebrating our progress. So a very big thank you to the team who've helped make today a success, to Anthony Talui from SPREP for assembling a great program, Amy Swang for making the technology run smoothly, to my co-moderator, Kate Noble, and all of the panelists we're privileged to have with us, and to each of you for your presence and involvement here today. Very big thank you for joining, and I do encourage you to join Roundtable Session 2 tomorrow on technological innovations with public-private partnerships, and Roundtable Session 3 on Thursday on bridging people and waste, enhancing consciousness in waste management. Thank you, and I'll close the session here.